Today I was leading a class session in a course that I have been teaching for more than 20 years at this point. It's kind of a staple class in some of the places that I've taught, religions of the world or world religions, and we were focusing on Chinese religions, and so that meant that I had to talk with my students quite a bit about, the culture of ancient China all the way up to present times and the great diaspora of Chinese people everywhere in the world, basically, and to bring in a number of interesting concepts. And I got to reminiscing after the class session was done about something that happened with me in my college times. So back in the early 1990s, up at Lakeland College, now Lakeland University, near Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And it also made me think about a job opportunity that I let slide through my fingers. I might be a very different person and be doing quite different work had I taken that opportunity. So I'll tell you about it in a bit. So at Lakeland College, it was my sophomore year, and I think it was probably just a few weeks into that. I was living in what was called the honors dormitory. We had a suite, and I had my own room, so that was kind of a nice deal for me. I was engaged to a local girl from town who was majoring in art and writing. I was going to some of her writing classes, and we met because I was modeling for one of her drawing classes. And then we, struck up a conversation and struck up a romance and all that. That'll be a whole other story I'll tell some other time. But she lived in town. I lived on campus. And I had, a job working for the art department. The modeling was one thing. I also did carpentry, and I worked as a docent in the gallery and stuff like that. And I was enjoying myself. I always loved being in college. I loved learning, and I got to have quite a fun time doing a lot of things as well as extracurriculars, we'll call them. So I got an offer for a new job, and I don't quite remember who actually offered it to me, but it had to do with foreign students, specifically Chinese students, Chinese language students from Taiwan. So I was being asked if I would consider 10 hours a week tutoring to Chinese students who were enrolled in a U.S. history class, and we're having trouble with it. Now, Lakeland College had its own branch campus in Japan, so there were always quite a few Japanese exchange students, but they also had some sort of an arrangement with some Chinese schools, and so they were bringing foreign students from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, and there was even one from Mainland China who I would later on meet. So it started out with me saying, I can tutor. I understand U.S. history pretty well, and I'll work with these guys. 10 hours a week sounds fine. And I think if I remember right, it paid better than minimum wage. So that was another inducement to doing it. So I meet these two guys. One is kind of a short and stocky guy who is very outgoing, whose English wasn't great, but was, quite friendly. His name was Xia, and he didn't have an English name the way many Chinese students will also take. They'll have a Chinese name and an English name. He just went by Xia. And then there was Chris, and his Chinese name was Wenxi, and he was taller, very skinny, a little bit more reticent until you got to know him. Xia was the more outgoing guy, and Chris was a bit more, not withdrawn, just more introverted, right? And so, what's your textbook? What's the trouble you're having? And stuff like that. And we start working together. And as it turns out, I could be very helpful for them. And I would do things like put together study guides for them. And it's very interesting because quite quickly, word got around that there's this American guy, Greg, who's kind of weird himself. He's been in the Army, he's got long hair, he plays heavy metal, and he's a philosophy and mathematics major. And, once I had shown that I could be helpful for 2 Chinese students, I started getting introduced to all these other Chinese students. And very quickly, I got to meet Chris's, at that time, girlfriend, Dan Ying, who is, she was a very interesting person. We're actually still in touch on Facebook. And she's very, very cool. And she's done some interesting things with her life down the line, very much about food. And she was kind of acerbic, had a great sense of humor and all of that. And then there were some others as well. There was Charles, who is from mainland China, right? So he's from a somewhat different culture, but, speaks Mandarin. There was an older guy, and I don't remember his name, and he had actually been a manager of a 4-star hotel in Taiwan, and he's over studying. There were a few other students as well, many of whom I've forgotten the names of, but I can picture their faces. So what ends up happening is I'm working with Sha and Chris, and before too long, the purview of my work expands from just U.S. history. I started having people coming to me saying, can you look at my paper? Can you help me improve it? Can you give me some pointers? And it was interesting because, I'd already edited people's papers before that. I actually ghost wrote papers in the past for, people, not for these students, but I took their papers and I would say, oh, okay, so here's a common grammar mistake that gets made. I'll fix this. And I learned early on when I was copy editing their papers, don't do too much. Because at one point, I had improved one of the papers as far as grammar went, not as far as like thought or style. These are smart students. I had improved it so much that they actually got in a little trouble. The instructor was like, you didn't write this paper, it's clearly beyond your writing abilities. And so I learned, dial back a little bit, leave a couple, common mistakes in there. But I also got to see, like, what are the interference areas between Mandarin and English, or for that matter, Cantonese and English, similar issues that are coming up. So anyway, I begin now working with students in English classes and even in literature classes, in philosophy classes, in a whole bunch of other classes that are not directly connected to what I'm doing. And I'm putting in more than 10 hours a week. So actually the person who'd hired me is like, well, you can go as high as 15 or 20, but we're not going to pay for anything more. And I was like, well, there's a lot of people coming to me for help. And we wound up with this sort of informal arrangement. And it was really quite interesting. So most of these students actually were from, either they were wealthy themselves or from very wealthy families, fairly wealthy families. And the reason that they were studying in the United States were, for the most part, they hadn't made it into the high-level universities there. And getting an American degree from a college would look good and set things up for them. So they had means and resources. And Sha and Chris and Danny were all living together in an apartment. There were other Chinese students who'd come to visit them. And they began having me come over to help them out with their stuff. And then they would cook for me. And pretty soon, I was being invited over all the time. And, we'd do some work together on literature or, history. I'd maybe prepare a study guide or something like that for a test. But a lot of the time, we would tell stories and watch TV shows or movies, and they would cook. And the food that I had was really quite extraordinary because some of them, Danny, Sha, really good cooks. And this guy, and I can't remember his name, Frank, that was his name. I don't remember his Chinese name, who had been the manager of the hotel. He was an amazing cook. He could walk into your kitchen, which he did one day, when I was helping him with a different class. By that time, I was living in an apartment in Sheboygan Falls, and I'll get to that in a moment. And he's like, "What do you have in the fridge?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know. You can take a look, right?" And he's like, "Oh, I can make something with this." And he whipped me up a 3-course meal that was just amazing. So, I got introduced to hot sour soup, all sorts of Chinese food that I'd never had. Because, what did we have over here up until that time? Well, you have the Americanized Chinese food that, like orange chicken. And, my mom used to make something called chop suey, which is definitely an American Chinese recipe. And what she made wasn't, even like great chop suey, but we loved eating it as kids. So I got introduced to this entire like culinary world, and I got to see people saying, okay, here's the spice that you use for this. Here's this. Try a bit of this while we're cooking it. Here's where we got these fresh ingredients from. We go to this market here. Interestingly, of course, there wasn't any like Chinese market in Sheboygan, but there were a lot of Hmong people living in the whole Sheboygan area, the whole Fox cities. And so you could get your hands quite easily on, say, bok choy, right? Or other things that would go into East Asian cooking. So anyway, I ate really well. I was a smoker back then, so they would, they'd give me cigarettes, they'd be like, hey, have a pack. And I'd be sitting there working, and we started spending more and more time together. And I actually spent so much time with them that my fiancee felt jealous and didn't really like it. She was a jealous type anyway, so that was always kind of an issue. I think that was part of what did the relationship in, among several other things down the line. And I'm the kind of person who always wants everybody to like each other and get along. And I would invite her along, and she'd show up and she'd be kind of sour, she'd actually make faces and stuff. And it's funny because her name was Ambra, and the Chinese students would call her Yemba, which means, according to them, salt. So anyway, this whole relationship is developing, and we're spending a lot of time together. I'm helping them out with other courses, helping them prepare other things, getting papers ready for stuff, and really enjoying myself with them. And then over winterim, I began taking a Mandarin Chinese class. And winterim, for those who don't know about these sorts of classes, it's something that some colleges here in the United States will do. Sometimes it's called January term or stuff like that. And so instead of going, you go home over Christmas break, and then you come back to school. And in a lot of schools, you just start up the spring semester. In some schools, like Lakeland College, they would have this January term. And during it, there would be 4 weeks. And during those weeks, you would meet every single day, five days a week, for 3 hours. It could be in the morning, it could be in the afternoon. And so it was really great. Like I took a class on the Arthurian legends and literature with Lucretia Crawford, a wonderful class. I did that my freshman year. Later on, I did another class with this great teacher, Ronender, who taught a class on the history of the American West, meeting every day. But my sophomore year, I took a class with a professor. I want to say his name was David Black, and he was married to another professor, and she was Chinese from Taiwan. He had studied in Taiwan and worked there for quite a while. And then they met, and then they came back and got hired at Lakeland College, and they team taught this class together. So it was a very intensive study of Mandarin. And, you learned a bit of writing. They weren't using the simplified characters. They were, because, Mainland China was using that at the time, and Taiwan was using the older characters, which is good because it's easy to go from from the older to the newer. It's harder to go from the newer to the older. So you do some writing, and of course you're learning about the tones and doing some conversational stuff. And, I'd already learned a little bit of Chinese, just engaging with Danny and Chris and Sha and some of the other people. But this kind of upped my game. I never became really fluent or proficient, but they loved the fact that I was interested in learning their language, and it opened up all sorts of cool doors. And at that time, I was, learning and getting better and better and better and stuff like that. So I'd ask them questions like, well, what's that called? What's that called? Like a kid, right? But they really enjoyed it. And I learned, slurs like, David's a big nose, or, things like that, all sorts of jokes. We used to actually call Charles Tamadabi Charles because he would swear all the time, and his favorite swear was Tamadabi, and you can find out what that means. It's a rather obscene thing to say. And so anyway, long story short, I begin, studying Chinese and making some progress with it. By the end of my sophomore year, Ambra and I had set a date for getting married and stuff like that, and we're starting to plan stuff. And I moved to Sheboygan Falls with her. We got an apartment, actually half of a house above something. We would later break up, and I'd be stuck with that. But the Chinese students would come and visit. Amber didn't like that too much, but what are you going to do, right? And I'll also mention that my mom, who was always a very outgoing person, you may have heard me talk about her in other videos, Monique Sadler, a very cool person. She actually had some of the Chinese students, again, mostly Danny, Chris, and Sha, come down, hang out with them. She gave them old furniture for their apartment when she was, buying a new couch. She'd be like, could they use my old couch? Could they use this sort of stuff? And I don't know, they always really, really clicked. They liked her, she liked them. She'd come up to visit me at Lakeland, and she'd, take us all out to eat or things like that. And so they had a great time together as well. And so I'm, spending a lot of time with these students. Now, most of them would end up graduating. They were a little bit further ahead of me, so they ended up graduating at the end of my junior year. And so I wouldn't see most of them senior year. But midway through my junior year, I'm living in Sheboygan Falls. I'm commuting to school. I'm also working security by that time, but I'm still doing tutorial stuff and hanging out with the Chinese students quite a bit. And then Ambra breaks up with me. And again, whole story that could be told about that. And so I'm, sort of on my own. And I go through the breakup thing. Oh, I'll never love again. Oh, what, this is terrible. And then I'm like, oh, this is actually not bad, Later on, I'll start dating somebody who I met in one of my classes before. And interestingly, once Ambra had broken up with me, and the Chinese students are having parties and having me over to console me and feeding me and stuff like that, then there's some hints. Maybe you'd want to date somebody in this circle. And it's kind of interesting. There really wasn't anybody who I was all that, you could say, compatible with, but there were some offers, right? So that goes on for a while, and I'm still, hanging out with them. And then I'm going to come to the job offer that was really quite interesting. So it's getting to the end of junior year. And as far as I remember, I could be recalling this wrong, Chris and Danny and Sha are all going to graduate. And Sha brings to me an idea. He says, my dad has a business in Taiwan. It's actually a quite prosperous business. And I think, I've told him about you. He might be interested in hiring you. And I was like, well, what would he want me for? I'm studying philosophy and mathematics. And he's like, well, I think what he would want you to do is read letters and write letters. So basically, and I think Sha probably just didn't explain it very well. And I was like, what the hell would I want to do that for? That doesn't really sound that interesting to me. And I didn't take it seriously. And, I've thought about this before. What did they actually have in mind? I would have been something like a secretary handling business, finding out how business worked, being over there in Taiwan. My Mandarin would have gone through the roof. It would have been an entirely different life trajectory and career for me, most likely. I don't know if I would have come back to the U.S. permanently, or whether I would have stayed in East Asia and, done all sorts of things over there. I probably wouldn't have gone to graduate school, but I probably would have learned all sorts of other things along the way. Who knows what my life would have turned out like. But I didn't consider it. I wanted to do other stuff instead that had to do with philosophy or mathematics. I was like, well, why would I want to do that? Looking back on it, I'm not saying I made the wrong choice, because I love the life that I have, and I'm so happy that I've got, the children that I have and the wife that I have, and the different opportunities that I've enjoyed over time. But that would have been an interesting prospect for me. And I can say this. I've had quite a few Chinese friends over the years and colleagues. I've never really, I've made a couple stabs at learning Mandarin better using my old textbooks and things like that, but never made that much progress. And frankly now, I can read things on a Chinese menu and ask for water and surprise people by saying, I only speak a little bit of Chinese and things like that. Had I gone there, I probably would have been, bilingual within a fairly short time. And who knows what that would have led to in terms of my philosophical development and studies and writings and things like that. I do want to mention one other thing that I had brought to mind before in talking about Chinese restaurants. So in Waukesha, where my mom was living at the time, there was a Chinese restaurant. And, the Chinese restaurants in the United States quite often specialize in a particular region of cuisine. So we've got a great Szechuan place here in Milwaukee. Back then, Tsinghua was a Beijing-style restaurant, and the Chinese students had heard about it. So we went there. Me, Danny, Chris, Shah, maybe Frank, and I think there were maybe 2 other people. And of course, we go in, and it's a family, as typically is the case, running it. And they, come over, and then immediately, Chris and Danny and Shah kind of take over, and they're ordering all these things in Mandarin. I could just kind of vaguely follow the conversation. They're like, "You're going to love this. You're going to love this." It was all stuff that wasn't on the menu, but they knew to request, and they're like, "Can you make this?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, we make really great stuff." That was one of the best Chinese meals I ever had at this essentially 3-star restaurant in the east end of Waukesha, because they pulled out the stops for all of my Chinese friends, because they knew what to ask for, what to suggest. So that was really cool. And as I mentioned before, I had some really, really good food. Learned some principles of cooking, learned how to do things, learned all about various dumplings for different occasions, and ate so much good food that I started getting an interest in Chinese cuisine as a result. So you can tell that these experiences left, kind of a mark on me, and were important to me, particularly in my early 20s at that time of my life. So I thought I would share them with you, since I was ruminating about them a little bit earlier today, and hopefully you find these interesting.